Many organizations rush into scaling Agile without proper preparation, often resulting in magnified problems, increased costs, and delayed outcomes, undermining the very goals they hope to achieve. The good news is that if you follow three basic rules of the road, you can avoid costly mistakes, derailments, and set up your organization for success. Let's get started by understanding what we mean by scaling Agile. What does that mean? We're talking about expanding the Agile mindset, practices, and tools across teams, departments, or the entire organization. Now, this often involves using frameworks, and there's a ton of frameworks. There's a whole list, and the list is constantly expanding. And especially these days, where there's so much turmoil in an agile space, people keep coming up with new ones. So watch this space; it's changing quite a bit. I put a note next to Spotify. Spotify, people always refer to it as a scaling framework, and it doesn't really belong on this list. There's several reasons for that. Just keep that in mind. It's a topic for sometime in the future they'll cover it. But for now, just take note. There's a lot of different options. Maybe you've heard about some of these, and maybe you think that there's only one scaled framework. No, there's many to choose from. And the differences between them are important to understand because some of them work better with different types of organizations. So choosing wisely and taking the time to select a framework that aligns well with your organization is an important step that can save you a lot of problems down the road. So when we're talking about scaling, there are common motivations to do it. For example, there's a desire for uniformity and alignment across teams. This is the waterfall mindset at play. The waterfall mindset is looking for that standardization across teams, departments, the entire enterprise, because it knows that standardization leads to optimization and improvements in efficiency and speed and all those things, which is fine when you're talking about simple and complicated work. And as I've said it many times, and I will continue to say it, we're dealing with an entirely different space. We need to come to understanding and accepting that humanity has already solved a lot, if not the majority, of the simple problems. We can't continue to manage the work with the same tools that we've always used because the work is increasingly complicated and requires a different way of managing the work. This is why I talk about project management as opposed to product management. These are very different. Project management is fine for the simple work. It is not for the complicated work, complex work. So yes, there is this tendency, very understandable. Waterfall is looking for this uniformity across the teams. However, that is not the way that this works. We need to be looking at the characteristics of the work that each of the teams is doing and then figuring out what the best alignment of tools, practices, and mindset is for each one of the teams. And we extend that to the enterprise level as well. There's also another common reason to want to scale is because executives they exert a lot of pressure and they want to see company-wide benefits that Agile promises. Perfectly understandable. There's a huge commitment and a huge investment made in going down the Agile path. And very understandably, they want to see benefits from that investment. However, this mindset again fails to acknowledge and recognize that different areas of the organization need to behave differently because the work that is done is not homogeneous. So for some areas, agile will be more prevalent or perhaps the only approach, and for others it may be non-existent. Need to look carefully to have an alignment, proper alignment. Another reason is the belief that scaling will solve existing inefficiencies, and by and large, it can. When properly applied, when properly deployed, it can resolve a lot of inefficiencies and bring us tremendous results. That's the potential. However, it's not a guarantee. There's nothing about it that is a formula that can be easily applied and ensure that there will be success in all cases. That's not the case. In some cases, actually, it can make things worse. It can intensify problems. So we have to be really careful about that. And there are misconceptions about scaling. Related to something I just said, And there's a belief that all teams across the enterprise have to be agile teams. That's not true. There again, we go back to look at the type of work that the teams are doing. Some teams will be doing work that aligns perfectly well with waterfall, and they will continue to align well with waterfall. Therefore, that is a proper way of managing that type of work. It doesn't mean that they have to be completely excluded from the agile transformation. When we expand agile and we think of lean agile, both sides of it, there's a lot on the lean side. Lean doesn't care whether it's agile or waterfall work. It has approaches and has methods that allow us to inspect the work and optimize it, inclusive of waterfall work. So there's a lot that we can do to help waterfall teams improve what they're doing, leveraging what we know from the agile side. But that doesn't mean that they have to fundamentally change the way that they're working. It's just simply looking at how the agile approaches can help improve what they're currently doing without fundamentally changing what they're doing. So there's a lot of variability, which is defined by the type of work, the type of teams, and the way that they work. We just need to align things to give them the best processes and tools that are going to help them. Another misconception is that all agile teams have to use the same practices. And I just touched on that. No, it depends on the type of work that they're doing. For some teams, continuous integration and deployment may make perfect sense, and others, they don't do any coding, so that doesn't make any sense to them. The concept of continuous integration and deployment might make sense, but the tool doesn't. So we need to look at what Agile has to offer in the mindset and the tools and the practices, and look carefully at what the team is doing, how they're working, and then figure out what pieces are going to help them most. This is not a one size fits all. Look, again, this is highly customized because the nature of the work requires it. Another misconception is that scaling is the best approach for inter-team communications. This one can get funny because, in a way, yes, scaling creates the bridges and the highways where teams that previously didn't communicate directly are now able to do it. And by virtue of that, we avoid game of telephone and misunderstanding and miscommunications. And yes, indeed, it can improve the communications. However, if we haven't taken the proper steps and the teams aren't at a level of maturity, agile maturity, that is compatible with other teams, it can be a lot of fireworks. If there's a lot of team dysfunctions, they're going to bring those dysfunctions to the entire enterprise, and they'll have ready access, direct access. So whereas before they were working through a series of filters, the layers of the organization that stood in between them and others that protected from that happening, now all of a sudden they have direct access and they can bring their fun to all the organization. That can be painful. Okay, so yes, it has the potential, it can. And again, we need to be careful how we do this, because otherwise we could surface and mine our entire organization with dysfunctions that are going to hurt everybody. Now, there are typical challenges when we talk about implementing and going down the scaling path. And one of them, for example, is the loss of focus on agile principles in favor of processes. Or conversely, when there's an imbalance between the focus on the principles and the processes and tools, remember the first value of the Agile Manifesto: people and interactions over processes and tools. We need to have a balance between these. We always pay attention and we favor the people and interactions, because if we're destroying, if we're affecting, if we're hurting the people and interactions, the best tools in the world are not going to help us. They're potentially could get in the way. But when we have a balance between the two, we're paying attention to both sides. Now we have an opportunity to benefit from the changes that we're making. When we over focus on either one of them, that's going to get in the way. Another one is that as we go down the scaling path, the increased complexity leads to slower decision making. So if the enterprise hasn't been properly prepared to deal with the increase in information, the speed of information coming at them, they're going to become the enterprise is going to become bogged down, and that will lead to slower decision making, which is exactly the opposite of why we want to scale. We want to scale so that we can leverage the perspective, the viewpoints, of the entire organization, the entire enterprise, to allow us to make faster, better decisions, which works if we properly prepare, if we take the proper steps to get there. If day one we try to do it, no, that's going to slow us down. And I see that all the time. It's unfortunately a lot of companies purchase the scaled frameworks. That's what they go out and purchase. And that's the first thing that they try to deploy. That doesn't make any sense. That creates a lot of friction, a lot of conflict, and it doesn't deliver. That's the bottom line. It can't. You have to start at the beginning. You can't start at the end. Scaling is the Olympics. That's not where we start. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of companies start. And then there's misalignment between teams and organizational goals. One of the things that happens when we scale is that we uncover that there was this disconnect between what the teams thought the organization needed of them and what they actually doing on a day-to-day basis, and what the organization thought the team was doing and what they needed of them. So scaling gives now the opportunity of both of these sides to have those direct communications and check on each other, and the surprise, oh, you're doing that, I didn't realize that. Oh, you needed that, I didn't realize that. There's this opportunity to surface that, which is great. That's really good, because now we can all be on the same page, and now we can all realize what reality actually looks like. And we need to be prepared when that happens to just simply work through it. Understand that this is normal. It happens in all organizations, and we just need to get through it. So I mentioned 3 rules of the road that can help us avoid a lot of the problems that we run into when we scale. And I'm just going to mention them, and then I'm going to go into the details of each one of them. First is you can't scale nothing. Second is scaling has a magnifying effect. And the third is to avoid scaling if possible. So let's start with you can't scale nothing. It sounds silly, but unfortunately, this is perhaps one of the biggest problems that I see, that I run into, because you can't grow a tree if you don't have a seed. And that's the problem, is when companies and organizations purchase scaling frameworks, they don't start at the beginning. They're trying to start at the end. They're trying to start at the Olympics. That's a setup. No organization is just intuitively and natively prepared for the strength, the power, the speed, the complexity of scaling. We need to start at the beginning. So we need to start with basic capabilities. Teams must be proficient in the Agile basics. Yes, Scrum and Kanban are some of them, and there's many other things, retrospectives, the way that we organize the work. A very critical one is looking at the work, how we define the work, how we slice the work in such a way that leads to iterative deliveries. These are skills that need to be developed. And we have to have that strong before we scale. If we haven't figured that out, and then we're coming to the entire enterprise and we're talking about what we're doing, it can be very confusing because we don't have the basics. So there needs to be a minimum level of Agile maturity in order to engage in scaling. We need to have that seedling in order to grow it to a tree. If we don't have the seedling, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Another thing that we need is strong leadership alignment with Agile values. When the leadership layer of the organization isn't aligned with the Agile values, they introduce a lot of friction. So we have one section of the organization trying to move and behave in a particular direction and way, while leadership is reinforcing the way that things have always been done. We don't have the basics. When we're scaling, we're bringing everybody together, and everybody needs to be on the same page. Everybody needs to be looking at things from at least a similar perspective. It's fundamentally derailing when leadership has a different perspective. At the beginning, One of the things that I recommend that teams look at doing is having a translation layer in between what the teams are doing, what they're learning, and leadership, because it makes sense to give leadership time and opportunity to manage the enterprise, the biggest, broadest perspective of the organization in the way that they're accustomed to for a while. As we go deeper and deeper, they're going to need to get also deeper and deeper into the way that everybody else is working. But initially, it's unrealistic to expect for this to happen overnight. So having a translation layer in between can help. This is where project management teams can be very helpful, because at the beginning of a transformation, um, they can serve as that conduit to translate into something that senior leadership is familiar with while the teams are developing the expertise, so that then they have something they can directly speak to leadership in this new language, in this new presentation. If we try to do it from day one, that leads to a lot of confusion. And for leadership, it can be very disorienting, because all of a sudden they're looking at their company from a completely different lens, and it doesn't make any sense. All of a sudden, all of the tools, all of the metrics, all of the perspective that they had about the organization changes overnight. That can be really derailing and potentially dangerous. So we need to have a mindfulness about this and create a scaling journey that gradually increases the participation of leadership. And we need leadership to be very involved and in alignment with what the company is doing. So both of these need to be working in tandem together. Another thing that we want to make sure is that we have an established culture of trust and psychological safety. I've mentioned in many of the videos that I've produced so far how critically important trust is. This is the foundation for a lot of the work that we're doing. And if there isn't trust, people are not going to experiment. People are not going to try new things. People are going to be very guarded in what they're doing, which in itself becomes an impediment to moving down the transformation path, to say nothing about scaling when the stakes are even higher. So as we venture, as part of figuring out if we have the basics, we need to do an organizational readiness assessment. There are maturity modelness or readiness assessments that we can apply to give us a good picture of where the organization is, where its strengths are, where it's already agile. I mean, I've come into companies, and from day one, I've looked at them and said, you already have agility in your DNA. All that we need to do is just fine tune and learn some practices, but it's already part of you. That's one scenario. And the rest of the organization can be at a completely different level, and requiring much more basic steps to be taken. We figure that out when we do these assessments. So the assessments are really important to paint a picture and create a customized journey, by identifying the milestones that need to be completed in order to do the scaling. As part of that, we identify gaps in skills, mindset, and infrastructure. There may be basic things that teams need, and then the organization, the enterprise needs in order to implement scaling. Trying to go venture into scaling without those, that's a setup. So we want to identify those and include them as part of the roadmap. So when we don't take these steps, when we don't have the foundation, when we don't have the basics, when we don't have something to scale, organizations that implement scaled frameworks without sufficient training, for example, are going to run into problems without the proper tools. Um, I've uh, I've encountered situations where organizations trying to scale, when you look at their work management systems, they have the basic version of them. They don't have the scaled version of them. Many times it's a different product, or it's a product add-on that you need to get in order to work at that scale level. If you don't have that already, you're not going to be able to support the reporting and the dashboarding that is needed in order to see the organization at that higher level. Another thing that happens is that teams become overwhelmed by the numerous new processes. These frameworks have a lot in them, and they become overwhelmed trying to learn it and do it both at the same time. That's juggling too much. While on top of it, they're expected to continue to deliver products and services. That can result in a lot of frustration and disengagement from teams, and individuals becoming just so overwhelmed that they can't continue. They struggle. So we need to build the necessary competencies and start by piloting. Piloting is very good and start small. Then build from those successes. Once you have a success to build and scale. So the second one of these rules of the world is scaling has a magnifying effect. And what this means is that, remember earlier I talked about how when we create the bridges and the highways of communication to bring teams that previously had to go through layers, now they can communicate directly. Well, it's fantastic. It's great that they can do that. And they're going to bring along all of the good stuff and all of the dysfunctions. We need to address those. So scaling has the ability. What it does is that it makes the good stuff even better. We can get it to huge levels of delivery and performance and benefit, and the bad stuff becomes also just as big. And when we ignore that, teams and the enterprise can run into very serious problems. Try to consider a team that doesn't know how to communicate. They have poor communication skills. They don't know how to reach consensus and make decisions efficiently. And now all of a sudden you bring that team into a wide company-wide meeting. They're going to bring all of that dysfunction into these meetings. These meetings are very costly. Some of the frameworks require the entire organization or big chunks of the organization to be together for multiple days in order to come up with a plan that everybody is behind. If teams don't have the ability to make decisions and to reach consensus in an efficient way, they're going to drag down those meetings, or worse, you're going to go through your 3 days and you're not going to have a plan that you can depend on. If you have very strong leaders who are accustomed within their space to always get their way, and they're not accustomed to compromise and brokering with others, and now you bring them into these huge meetings, that can be fireworks. That can get really contentious very, very, very quickly. Um, that's completely against the whole purpose of scaling and agile. So we need to be very careful. Just as there's a lot of promise and a lot of potential for good things to come from scaling, there's also a lot of risk, a lot of dangers that can come if not done appropriately. So strengths such as collaboration and adaptability scale positively. If the teams already have that, we're going to get really good results from teams already having this. But if they have poor communications and siloed thinking, that can grow exponentially. Now we have full blowouts during these meetings, these large meetings, because they're still operating in this very siloed mindset that has to be taken care of first. This is why we can't scale nothing. We need to have those basic skills and the basic mindset first before we scale it. Otherwise, it can be very dangerous. The type of team dynamics that we see when teams are under pressure because of scaling is, for example, that there's a strain in team relationships as the new processes are introduced. I mentioned before, they're overwhelmed. It's too much that's coming at them, and they are lacking the basic skills to be able to learn quickly, adapt quickly. Another thing that we can see is that there's an overemphasis on output instead of outcomes. This again is when we haven't established those basics of understanding that when we're in this agile mindset, we're looking at improving our outcomes, not increasing our outputs. In fact, in some cases, what we want is to reduce the outputs if at all possible. Because if we can get rid of things that aren't really contributing to the outcomes, and we can spend our time, energy, efforts, money on things that do, that's ideal. That's a maximum return of investment. So, is it possible? Does it work? Yes. If we've taken the time to set the proper foundation and we've paid attention to what strengths we're bringing into scaling and addressed any deficiencies, and we're aware of those deficiencies, we are prepared to deal with them if we have to, then yes, we can set ourselves up in a good way to move forward. If we haven't even looked, that's just rolling the dice on whatever's going to happen, and a lot of surprises, unpleasant surprises are going to happen. So we want to conduct retrospectives and feedback, have a lot of feedback loops to surface issues as we are scaling. This is going to be very destabilizing for teams, for the organization, for leadership, for the entire enterprise. So we need to make sure that we have a good pulse on what's happening so that we can address any concerns, any challenges, any impediments, and we can help people through this process. It's a lot. It's a lot to ask people to do. And we want to fix small scale problems before they grow into large scale barriers. This again is be careful what you're scaling. If you have good stuff, you have the potential to have great stuff. And if you don't, you could have a big mess in your hands. So the third one of the rules of the road is avoid scaling if possible. Many of the things that scaling can do can be achieved without scaling. In fact, you've been doing it. If you've been doing waterfall and you don't have this, well, you've been doing it. There are ways that you can achieve it. They're not as efficient, though. They're not as effective. They're heavier, but it's possible to do. It makes sense for a while to leverage that as far as you can take it until it no longer works. As if you can delay scaling, there are many benefits. First of all, as I mentioned, some of the scaling frameworks require for the entire organization or large chunks of it to meet all together, all layers of the organization. It's not just bringing a lot of teams together, it's bringing leadership into these meetings so that they can make real time decisions, strategic decisions, as teams offer their inputs and their information. So those are costly meetings. Just simply the salaries and multiplied by the number of hours, those are very expensive meetings. If we don't have a proper setup for those meetings to be successful, that's a huge waste. Um, let's not let's avoid having those large meetings for as long as we can. There will come a moment when we need them. It becomes obvious that we need it. Well, if we delay it long enough, we will have built enough strength, enough agility, enough maturity in an agile mindset and tools and practices that coming into those meetings will be a lot more successful. It'll be a lot easier to succeed in those meetings. So as we delay, we're buying into inefficiency. Let me give you a concrete example. One way in which we can have teams from different departments and different areas of the organization working together is instead of bringing the teams together, as for example, Scrum at Scale would say, you have the Scrum Masters coming together, and they're the ones who are communicating with each other. That works for a while. It works up to a point. Well, leverage that. That's your time that you have to help the teams and the organization mature in their practices until that's no longer efficient. Because eventually, naturally, what's going to happen is we're going to saturate the Scrum Masters. They're no longer going to be able to do this communication back and forth, and we're going to exceed their capacity. So before we get there, if we have matured our practices, now we are in a better position than if we had started scaling right away. So there's a value in delaying scaling as long as possible. Some organizations may discover that they actually don't need scaling, that what they have, yeah, it could be better, but it's good enough. And it's easily manageable for them or easier to manage than scaling. Therefore, it makes sense to stay without scaling. For some organizations, that works well, not for others. So we want to improve communication and cross-team collaboration without formal scaling. There are ways that we can do that. Explore those first. See if you can address any communication challenges that exist amongst teams. A concrete example. In Scrum, sprint reviews. Sprint reviews are very misunderstood. Most people just do demos, and that's not a sprint review. What you want to do is you want to have representatives from different areas of the organization, your stakeholders, participating in those meetings, having direct conversations with the teams that are implementing what they're building for them. These can be really, really effective meetings and powerful meetings where the people get to hear directly from their stakeholders what's needed, and the stakeholders get to hear how the teams are doing in implementation, often resulting in reprioritization or even work redefinition. I've seen during these meetings stakeholders take out entire sections of implementation that were expected upon realizing some of the realities that the teams were facing, leading to better prioritization and delivery of things that the stakeholders truly needed most. Once we do enough of that, and if you invite a lot of their stakeholders to participate, this is a good practice ground for leaders across the organization to get to work in this agile way that gives them comfort, familiarity. And once you've done that, now when you bring this into scaling, you have a much better chance of having successful meetings. But if you've skipped this, if you haven't done it, if you just simply put a checklist of, oh yeah, we did sprint review, the team got together, they talked about it, they went through everything, and then we moved on to the next thing. That's useless. That's not helpful. If you leverage, once again, have the basics, scale something, use the power of the practices that you've been learning, now you're setting yourself up for a good transition into scaling. If instead we just focus on efficiency versus more outputs and not better outcomes, we haven't really made any progress. So we can't expect going into scaling and have successful meetings and successful interactions. So we need to understand where scaling adds unnecessary bureaucracy. If there are ways that you can work within your current organization without adding more bureaucracy, do that. Do that first. Start there. It's when the organization is in a better place to communicate with each other across all levels of the organization. That's when you're in a better spot to do to scaling. And focus on delivering value over scaling for its own sake. Just because scaling sounds, oh, we get more. As I mentioned, if when bringing everybody together, you have the epiphany that doing less is going to allow you to deliver better outcomes, do that. Don't be afraid to say no to something that you thought you were going to do if it means delivering better value to your customers faster. So if there are foundational capabilities that aren't strong enough, or scaling won't directly improve your business outcomes, try something else first. Then explore the scaling options. So let's set expectations. So what we want to do is, when engaging in scaling, we want to make sure that the organization understands that this is a huge investment. It's going to take time, it's going to take effort, and it's going to take a lot of commitment from all levels of the organization. So we want to make sure that everybody understands that this is not going to happen overnight, that this is going to take its time. We need to allow for the gradual growth from the basics into maturing, into then getting into scaling. Set the expectation that this is going to take a lot. In the past, before AI, I would have said that in agile transformation into scaling, you're looking at probably 4 to 6 years, somewhere in there. Today, because of AI, I can see that's speeding up significantly. So thinking about 2 to 4 years is probably reasonable to think. And yet, you're talking about years. This is not something that's going to happen in a couple of months and a couple of training sessions and you're done. It's going to take time. So set a realistic timeline and realistic expectations. This is a long-term endeavor, not a quick fix. And set realistic milestones that allow for iterative improvement, always learning from your successes and your failures and figuring out the next steps. Give yourself the time and the opportunity to make those course corrections as you are scaling. You want to make sure that everybody has proper training, that they have the proper tools, the proper processes are understood, and the opportunity to play with them to the point of breaking them. It's very important to have those failures because those failures are going to teach the teams and the organization at large what not to do. If we don't give that opportunity, then you will have failures, but when it's far more critical and far more dangerous for the organization. So, taking a step back, you want to take an honest look at and make an assessment of your readiness. And you want to explore different options, different approaches, to look very carefully. Don't assume that one scaling framework is the answer. Just because a lot of people use it doesn't immediately mean that it's safe for you to use. Some of these frameworks are incompatible with companies because of the DNA of the company. So you really want to take a close look at what's possible, what's available, and then make a choice. But that only happens through inspection and taking the necessary steps, one step at a time. Don't rush it. So, if you'd like to learn more about building strong, agile foundations that can safely scale, then click one of these, and I'll be happy to tell you all about it. Until the next time.